June 22, 1941, before the sun fully rose over the forests and fields of the Western Soviet Union, millions of men were already moving, engines already growling, artillery already aimed, and history already betrayed. Because what was about to unfold was not just an invasion, not just a war, but a collision of ideologies so violent that it would grind entire nations into ash. And for the Soviet Union, it began not with heroic music or prepared defenses, but with shock, disbelief, and blood pouring into the soil as German shells ripped through border posts that had been ordered not to fire back. Because Stalin, the man who ruled the USSR with iron fear, had convinced himself that Hitler would never dare attack so soon, that warnings from spies, defectors, and even allies were exaggerations, provocations, lies meant to drag the Soviet Union into a premature conflict. And so when Operation Barbarossa began, it caught the Red Army not marching proudly into battle, but scattered, confused, half-mobilized, and fatally unprepared for the most massive invasion in human history, an invasion involving over 3 million Axis troops, thousands of tanks, aircraft, and guns, all unleashed along a front stretching nearly 3,000 kilometers from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. And from the Soviet perspective, this was not just a military disaster in the making, it was an existential threat, because Nazi Germany did not come to negotiate borders or secure concessions. It came to annihilate the Soviet state, enslave its people, and erase its ideology from the map. And the terrifying truth was that in the opening weeks, it almost succeeded, as entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed, communications collapsed, commanders vanished or were killed, and soldiers who had been trained more in political loyalty than battlefield flexibility suddenly faced a mechanized war unlike anything they had imagined, a lightning war designed not just to defeat them, but to disorient them, crush their morale, and shatter the myth of Soviet invincibility that propaganda had so carefully constructed. Because the Red Army of 1941 was massive on paper, but hollow in reality, still bleeding from Stalin's purges of the late 1930s that had executed or imprisoned thousands of experienced officers, leaving behind a command structure ruled by fear, where initiative could mean execution and hesitation could mean death. And when German panzers smashed through border defenses in places like Belarus and Ukraine, Soviet units often waited for orders that never came. Radios failed, maps were outdated, and entire divisions were swallowed in encirclements like Bialystok, Minsk and Smolensk, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. And from Moscow, the reports were so catastrophic that many were dismissed as exaggerations or sabotage, because the scale of the disaster was psychologically impossible for Stalin to accept, leading to days of paralysis at the very top of the Soviet state, days where the leader of the USSR reportedly withdrew, stunned by the realization that his calculations had been catastrophically wrong. And while German propaganda celebrated unstoppable progress eastward, Soviet civilians began to understand that this was not another distant war. This was a fight for survival, as refugees clogged roads, cities prepared for evacuation, factories were dismantled and loaded onto trains bound for the Urals and Siberia, and the entire nation began a desperate transformation from a peacetime society into a war machine built on sacrifice, endurance, and terror. Because the Soviet response to Barbarossa was not immediate brilliance, but brutal adaptation, learning through loss, paying for every lesson with blood, as commanders who failed were shot, soldiers who retreated without orders were branded cowards, and entire units were ordered to stand and die to buy time. Time to move industry east, time to mobilize reserves, time to understand the enemy, and time to harden a population that had been told for years that socialism had made it invulnerable, when in reality it was now being tested to its absolute limit. And yet even in these darkest opening months, when Kiev fell, when Leningrad was encircled, when German forces seemed poised to strike directly at Moscow, something began to change beneath the surface, because the Soviet Union, unlike Germany, had depth, not just geographical depth, but human depth, the ability to absorb losses that would have shattered any other state. And as the Wehrmacht pushed further east, its supply lines stretched, its vehicles wore down on terrible roads, its soldiers encountered a land and a resistance that refused to collapse, and the war that Hitler believed would be finished in months slowly transformed into something else entirely, something the Soviet people would later call the Great Patriotic War, not just a defense of territory, but a total, merciless struggle where survival justified everything, and victory, no matter the cost, became the only acceptable outcome. And as the summer of 1941 dragged forward, the Soviet state began to awaken from shock into rage. Because the illusion that this war could be managed with cautious diplomacy or limited engagement had evaporated, replaced by the raw understanding that Germany intended not merely to defeat the Red Army, but to destroy the Soviet people themselves. An intention made horrifyingly clear by the behavior of the invading forces, the Einsatzgruppen following behind the front lines, executing political commissars, Jews, intellectuals, and anyone deemed undesirable, turning towns and villages into killing fields. And from the Soviet perspective, this brutality hardened resolve, even as it exposed terrifying weakness, because the Red Army was losing men at a rate that defied comprehension, entire formations ceasing to exist in days, while German commanders confidently reported victory after victory. Yet beneath these triumphs, cracks were already forming. Because the Wehrmacht had gambled everything on speed, and speed demanded perfect coordination, fuel, spare parts, and roads that simply did not exist in the Soviet interior. And while German tanks surged forward, Soviet railways were sabotaged, bridges destroyed, crops burned, and civilians evacuated or forced to flee eastward in scenes of chaos that nevertheless denied the enemy the easy sustenance it expected. And at the same time, Stalin, now fully committed to total war, unleashed the full machinery of the Soviet state, issuing orders that were ruthless and uncompromising, orders that forbade retreat without permission, orders that created blocking detachments to shoot deserters, orders that treated surrender as treason punishable even against a soldier's family. Policies that were brutal, often inhumane, but effective in one crucial way. They made collapse impossible, because fear of one's own government became as powerful a motivator as fear of the enemy. And as German Army Group Center advanced toward Moscow, the symbolic and political heart of the Soviet Union, the battle transformed into a race against time, with German planners believing that the capture of the capital would shatter Soviet command and force surrender, while the Soviets understood that Moscow's survival was synonymous with national survival. And so the city was fortified with desperate urgency, civilians digging trenches, anti-tank obstacles erected in parks and streets, factories converted overnight to produce weapons, and even as panic spread, Stalin made a calculated decision that would echo through history. He stayed, refusing to evacuate, appearing in public, addressing the nation, and signaling that Moscow would not be abandoned. A psychological act as important as any military maneuver, because it told both soldiers and civilians that this was the line beyond which retreat would not be allowed. And yet, militarily, the situation remained catastrophic, as Soviet forces attempted repeated counterattacks that often ended in disaster due to poor coordination and lack of experience, while German commanders increasingly faced the reality that their troops were exhausted, their vehicles worn down, and their soldiers unprepared for the scale of resistance they now encountered, especially as autumn rains turned roads into seas of mud, immobilizing tanks and trucks in what became known as the Rasputitsa, slowing the German advance to a crawl and buying the Soviets precious weeks. Weeks used to bring in fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, divisions that had been held back for fear of Japanese attack until intelligence confirmed that Japan would strike south instead of north.
And these troops arrived hardened, better trained, equipped for winter warfare, and crucially, still cohesive. And as winter descended earlier and harsher than German planners had anticipated, the balance began to shift. Because German soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing, their weapons froze, engines failed, frostbite claimed thousands, while Soviet troops, accustomed to the climate and now fighting with the desperation of defenders whose homes lay behind them, launched counteroffensives that stunned the invaders, pushing them back from the gates of Moscow, marking the first major strategic failure of Hitler's war. And from the Soviet perspective, this moment was transformative, because it proved that the Wehrmacht was not invincible, that it could be stopped, driven back, and bled. And although the cost was staggering, millions dead or wounded, cities ruined, entire regions devastated, the psychological tide had turned, and the war was no longer a one-sided onslaught, but a grinding struggle. One that the Soviet Union, with its vast manpower, relocated industry, and merciless resolve, was uniquely positioned to endure, even as the price paid by soldiers and civilians alike would scar generations. Because Barbarossa was no longer just an invasion, it had become a war of annihilation in which compromise was impossible, and survival demanded not only courage but a willingness to absorb suffering on a scale the world had never witnessed before, setting the stage for battles yet to come that would make the opening months seem almost merciful by comparison.
And with the German failure before Moscow, the illusion of a quick victory finally collapsed. But from the Soviet perspective, this did not mean relief, because the winter counteroffensive, though symbolically powerful, exposed another harsh reality. The Red Army was still clumsy, still learning, still wasting lives at an appalling rate, and the enemy, though battered, was far from defeated, regrouping, adapting, and preparing for a renewed assault that would once again test whether the Soviet state could survive sustained pressure. And as 1942 began, Stalin and the High Command faced a brutal strategic dilemma, whether to consolidate defenses and rebuild methodically, or to continue launching offensives to keep the enemy off balance. And driven by fear of giving Germany time to recover, they chose aggression, a decision that would lead to disastrous Soviet attacks in places like Kharkov, where poorly planned offensives collapsed into encirclements eerily reminiscent of 1941, costing hundreds of thousands of men and reinforcing the terrible truth that victory would not come from enthusiasm or ideological certainty, but from painful, methodical reform. And yet, even as battlefield failures mounted, something profound was changing behind the lines, because the evacuation of industry eastward, one of the greatest logistical feats in history, was beginning to bear fruit. Entire factories rebuilt in the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia, producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft in numbers that steadily surpassed German output. And unlike Germany, which still relied on a complex web of occupied territories and vulnerable supply routes, the Soviet war economy became brutally efficient, prioritizing quantity, simplicity, and speed over elegance. Producing weapons like the T-34 tank, rugged, reliable, and suited to the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front, a machine that embodied the Soviet approach to war, not refined, but relentless. And as equipment improved, so too did doctrine, as surviving commanders learned through bloodshed the importance of coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power, slowly moving away from rigid pre-war theories toward a more flexible, layered style of warfare that could absorb shocks and deliver crushing counterblows. And while German forces in 1942 shifted their focus southward toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city that bore Stalin's name, Stalingrad, the Soviet leadership understood the stakes immediately, because oil meant survival for mechanized armies, and losing the Volga would sever vital transport arteries. And so the battle that followed became one of the most savage confrontations in human history, a fight not just for a city, but for the strategic future of the war, where Soviet soldiers were ordered to hold at all costs, often with nothing behind them but the river and orders that promised death for retreat and glory for resistance. And in the ruins of Stalingrad, the nature of the war changed again. Tanks became useless hulks amid shattered buildings. Long-range maneuver dissolved into close-quarter combat measured in meters and minutes, where factories, stairwells, and cellars were contested again and again. And Soviet troops, many barely trained, learned to fight with ferocity born of desperation, turning the city into a meat grinder that devoured German strength day by day, while Soviet planners quietly prepared a counterstroke on the flanks, targeting weaker Axis allies holding extended lines. And when that counteroffensive was unleashed in November 1942, it shattered the German Sixth Army, encircling it in a pocket of freezing ruin. And from the Soviet perspective, this was not merely a battlefield victory, but a strategic revelation. Proof that careful planning, deception, and coordinated operations could destroy even elite German formations. And as the encircled German forces starved and froze, refused permission to break out, and ultimately surrendered, the psychological impact echoed across the world. Because for the first time, an entire German field army had been annihilated, and the Red Army had demonstrated that it could not only survive annihilation, but deliver it in return. And yet, even in triumph, the cost was almost unimaginable, with casualties so immense that victory itself seemed soaked in tragedy, reinforcing the grim Soviet understanding that this war would be won not by brilliance alone, but by endurance, sacrifice, and a willingness to grind the enemy down no matter the human cost. And from this point onward, the momentum of Barbarossa had fully reversed, as the initiative slowly but inexorably passed to the Soviet Union, setting the stage for a relentless westward push that would eventually carry the Red Army all the way to Berlin, but only after years more of slaughter that would leave scarcely a family untouched by loss. And as the smoke of Stalingrad settled, the Soviet Union stood at a grim crossroads, victorious yet bled white, because while the destruction of the German Sixth Army marked a turning point, it did not end the war, and the Red Army now faced the even harder task of sustaining momentum across a front that stretched thousands of kilometers against an enemy that, though shaken, remained dangerous, disciplined, and technologically capable. And from the Soviet perspective, 1943 became the year where survival gave way to calculated dominance, where desperation slowly transformed into confidence as lessons learned through catastrophe were finally institutionalized. And nowhere was this transformation more visible than in the preparations for the coming German offensive around Kursk, because unlike earlier battles, the Soviet leadership now knew where the blow would fall, had time to prepare, and chose not to strike prematurely, instead constructing layer upon layer of defenses, minefields, anti-tank ditches, and artillery zones in depth, creating a defensive system designed not to stop the enemy outright, but to absorb and exhaust it. And when the German attack finally came in July 1943, it smashed into a wall of fire and steel, as Soviet soldiers, no longer surprised, fought from prepared positions, trading ground for time while inflicting devastating losses on German armor. And as the battle escalated into massive tank engagements like Prokhorovka, the Soviet command accepted losses without panic, understanding that attrition favored them now. Because for every tank destroyed, the Soviet factories could replace it faster than Germany ever could. And when the German offensive stalled and finally collapsed, the Red Army launched its own counterattacks, driving the enemy back and shattering any remaining German hope of regaining the strategic initiative in the east. And from the Soviet viewpoint, Kursk was not celebrated with naive triumphalism, but with a hard, sober satisfaction, because it confirmed what Stalin and his generals had come to believe, that the war would be won not by daring gambles, but by overwhelming force applied methodically. And as Soviet offensives rolled forward in late 1943 and 1944, liberating vast territories and pushing into Eastern Europe, the nature of the conflict shifted yet again, from defensive survival to offensive conquest, bringing with it moral complexities that Soviet propaganda rarely acknowledged. Because as Red Army soldiers advanced into lands long brutalized by German occupation, they were greeted both as liberators and as instruments of a new domination, and discipline, though officially enforced, often collapsed under the weight of vengeance, exhaustion, and trauma, a dark underside of victory that coexisted with genuine relief and gratitude from populations freed from Nazi terror. And at the strategic level, Soviet commanders refined their art, coordinating massive multi-front operations that crushed German forces through encirclement and relentless pressure, operations like Bagration that annihilated entire German army groups and demonstrated a level of operational sophistication unimaginable in 1941. And with each success, the Red Army grew more confident, more professional, yet no less ruthless. Because the memory of the invasion, of villages burned, civilians murdered, and comrades lost, burned too deeply to allow mercy to soften resolve. And by the time Soviet forces crossed into Germany itself in 1945, the war had come full circle, the invader now invaded, the annihilator now facing annihilation. And for Soviet soldiers, the final drive toward Berlin was fueled not only by orders, but by a personal hunger for justice, revenge, and closure, even as the human cost continued to mount in numbers that defied comprehension. And when Berlin finally fell, the red banner raised over the Reichstag, it symbolized not just victory over Nazi Germany, but the survival of the Soviet state against an assault designed to erase it. A victory purchased at a price so immense that celebration itself was subdued, heavy with grief, because nearly every Soviet family had paid something irreplaceable. And from the Soviet perspective, Operation Barbarossa was remembered not as a single campaign, but as the opening wound of a 4-year nightmare, a moment when the nation stood on the edge of destruction and chose, through fear, sacrifice, brutality, and resilience, to endure, to adapt, and ultimately to prevail, leaving behind a legacy of triumph inseparable from tragedy, and a war whose scars would shape Soviet memory, identity, and politics for generations to come.
And in the end, when the guns finally fell silent and the smoke drifted away from the ruins of Europe, the Soviet understanding of Operation Barbarossa hardened into something more than history. It became a wound that never fully closed, because victory did not erase the memory of how close annihilation had come, how fragile survival had been in those first catastrophic months of 1941, when the state nearly collapsed under the weight of its own mistakes. And from the Soviet perspective, the war was never remembered as a clean narrative of heroism alone, but as a brutal lesson written in mass graves, burned villages, and names etched onto monuments that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, a lesson that taught the leadership and the people alike that security could never again be taken for granted, that weakness invited destruction, and that preparedness, no matter how costly, was the price of survival in a hostile world. And this belief shaped everything that followed: the tightening of control over Eastern Europe, the obsession with military strength, the willingness to sacrifice comfort for power, because Barbarossa had proven that ideology meant nothing without force to defend it. And yet, beneath the official narrative of triumph and resilience lived quieter truths, of families who never learned where their sons were buried, of soldiers who returned broken and silent, of civilians who survived sieges, starvation, and terror only to rebuild their lives among ruins, carrying memories they rarely spoke aloud. And for them, Barbarossa was not a chapter in a textbook, but the moment their world ended and another began. And even as the Soviet Union presented itself as the great victor over fascism, the trauma of that initial invasion lingered in policy, culture, and fear, reinforcing a siege mentality that justified repression at home and suspicion abroad, because the memory of surprise, betrayal, and near destruction never truly faded. And so Operation Barbarossa, seen through Soviet eyes, was not merely the story of how the Red Army was attacked and eventually triumphed, but how a nation was forced to confront its own vulnerabilities, adapt through unimaginable suffering, and redefine itself through war, emerging stronger, harsher, and forever marked by the knowledge that its survival had depended not on mercy or chance, but on the willingness to endure losses so vast they reshaped the meaning of victory itself, leaving behind a legacy where pride and pain remained inseparable, and where the shadow of that June morning in 1941 continued to stretch across generations, a reminder that the Great Patriotic War began not with confidence, but with chaos, and was won not by perfection, but by unbreakable endurance at the edge of destruction.